Well, hey, and welcome to the Impactus Young Man's Podcast. My name is Jordan, and on this podcast, we help young men become, grow, and live as disciples of Jesus, and we try and help them navigate what it means to be a Christian man in today's cultural moment. Today on the podcast, we've got my good friend Nick Dukrin. He's a therapist, and we talk about men's mental health. You know, there's a lot of discussion around mental health, and in particular, men's mental health nowadays. We've got a whole month dedicated to that, and even you're seeing more conversation around vulnerability being a true strength. But at the same time, you see figures online and influencers talk about how men are to shape up and just pull up their socks and get on with things, to not be weak, but to show a stoic strength. And that's what it means to be a real man. And so how do you navigate this? Between these two polar opposites, how do you make sense of what it means to be a man that's mentally well, that lives authentically, but also as a man of responsibility? Well, today on the podcast, we discuss all sorts of things, and I think it'll be really engaging for you. This particular podcast is actually sponsored by the Canadian Bible Society. They're one of our premier sponsors for upcoming events this year, and we are so excited to partner with them. The Canadian Bible Society is all about the Bible and getting it into the hands of as many people as possible in their own language. And they do so much across the country and beyond. I mean, from translating to publishing to resourcing the local church with something called the Bible Course, man, their reach is endless. And so if you haven't ever checked out the Canadian Bible Society, head on over to their website and check them out now. Thank you guys for your sponsorship. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the podcast today. Well, Nick, man, thanks for joining me on the Impactus Young Man's Podcast.
Yeah, great to be here. Glad I could be a part and contribute in whatever way that's going to look.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, man. It's funny, you and I went to university together, and I was on residence, and you were a commuter. And so what that means is that we didn't get to know each other at all, basically.
I know, and then fast forward however many years, and here we are reconnected. It's pretty cool, pretty fun.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens. In fact, thinking about it, some of my best friends now are actually... they're all commuters, and we didn't really know each other in university at all, but we just happened to land in the same kind of, postal code. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, hey? How some of these connections kind of float off for decades and then kind of reemerge, and familiar faces become new-ish connections, and you get to work with each other in different ways instead of just debating by the foosball table things that neither of us know much about, or
Well, it's so funny you say that, because I think back to my first year of university and the amount of time wasted spent on terrible philosophical questions and the offense and just terrible attitudes that, the first year guys had of just being so sure of things. And now if you chat to those same guys, they're like, yeah, I don't really know about any of that.
Oh my word. Yeah. I remember being in first year and, being wildly impressed with everybody, just hearing these terms I'd never heard about. And I'm like, all of these people are brilliant. And then I also got on academic probation because I spent most of my time playing foosball. And, that was, not who I was as a high school student, and thankfully not who I was as a master's student. But man, my undergrad took some time for me to get my feet under. I really enjoyed foosball and listening to other people more than my assignments, and that showed in my grades. So
I didn't know that, Nick. I actually had you pegged as kind of a super brainiac kind of guy, but I didn't realize you were on academic probation.
My attitude, this is not a good attitude. I wouldn't recommend people follow this part, but I loved learning. So I really enjoyed listening and lecture, but I was like, I'm here to learn. I don't really care about these assignments. And sorry to mom and dad who might hear this, but that was really my attitude. I didn't care about assignments, but I actually did really enjoy learning a lot. So I do feel like I pulled a lot. I just didn't take the time to kind of put it down on paper, which those ideas don't form properly if you don't. But anyway.
That's so funny, man. And you jumped out and were you a biblical theology student?
Yeah, I did what's now the biblical studies. I think it was religious studies at the time. And I served in church while that was by the advice of my pastor to stay connected to the local church and, while doing studies. And, so from graduation, I stayed in ministry. And so kind of did that for about 12 years before transitioning to becoming a therapist, which I am now.
Crazy, man. And it's funny because, I think if you've got the counseling therapy itch, some guys land in ministry because they think like, I like helping people and those types of things. But the truth is, and hopefully this doesn't offend anyone, just because you're a pastor doesn't mean you should counsel people, just as a FYI. But you landed in it, full time. Why the transition? Like, why,
Yeah, why? How you separate?
How
Yeah.
did that happen?
Uh, I really did feel like I was following the Lord in that. So part of my journey with the Lord was really kind of learning to hear God's voice. And I do remember specifically when I was working at a small church and, I was part-time at the church and needed to kind of fill the other half, kind of make ends meet. And, was just praying to God, hey, what's next? And I felt him say counseling. And I said, well, that's cool. I need a job, not really to go to school. Like that doesn't really, at that time, the government was really helpful in helping you get back to school. So it actually was feasible for me to kind of almost treat school like a part-time job. And, so that was really, really helpful. So it really kind of came out of this place of me trying to be obedient to the Lord. And I think in hindsight, what I appreciate about that transition is that, it really felt like when I moved from being a pastor to a therapist, I got to double down on my gifts, double down on my personality, double down on my strengths. And so it's one of those things where it almost feels like I'm very grateful for the time I had in ministry. And yet the transition feels like, oh, wait, this is a way better fit. I'm more comfortable in my own skin.
Yeah.
I actually feel empowered to love and serve demographics that I wouldn't have normally been able to rub shoulders with had I just been in a church setting. And so parts of that sort of
Right.
parts of my heart that came alive being in the world and with people that are still connected to the church very much so, but to be connected to other people as well really comes alive when I had parachurch organization jobs or now a career outside of the church. So that part of me is coming alive and it feels like a good fit. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I would say we chatted a little bit before we jumped kind of on the recording, and I was like, "Oh man, Nick is so easy to talk to," and I'm like, "So clearly you're doing the right thing, man." And you're working at a men's clinic right now, amongst other things.
Yeah. So I work at a
correct?
men's clinic and I have my own private practice on the side as well. And I pretty much mostly see men and couples. And not exclusively, but that's the majority of my caseload. And if it's men, it's for the most part, if a man is facing it, then I'm probably helping someone with it. And working with couples. And sometimes working with the men is working with their relationship just through an individual perspective. Right. But that's a lot of the work that I am able to do with people.
If someone were to ask you in university or when you're a younger man that you'd be working with men in this way, would that have surprised you? Like working so closely in this way, or not?
I think
really?
so. Yeah. I think when I was in my early 20s, I really thought I would just plant a church. And especially
Right.
the model of ministry that I saw, a successful, shiny mega church was what I would have forecasted for myself. And so, not speaking in front of thousands, but instead speaking to individuals one at a time would not have been on my bingo card at the age of early 20s for sure.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is probably a different podcast, but the amount of young men like yourself that went to Bible college with kind of the big church, lights and sounds, smoke machine on there, like they started their ministry kind of visioning that way. Now in their 30s are going like kind of actually reacting against that and like finding themselves in churches that don't have any of that. Not that it's a bad thing. It's just it's an interesting trend that I've been seeing amongst my friends where a lot of us that dreamed of having like the coolest brand and the coolest logo and the coolest marketing are now going like, oh man, it's left us wanting a little bit. It's just interesting. I think in many ways, and as we talk about vulnerability and authenticity and stuff today, I think as men, we also are kind of craving that authentic experience.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just interesting you say that was your vision. That was my experience as well, man. I wanted to be,
Right.
I wanted to be on stage. I wanted to be it, but find myself going, man, maybe there's more to relationships than that. And so anyway, that's another podcast, but I'm just curious, Nick, sorry, about your work with men, man. And in particular, maybe some of the younger men that you work with. What's some of the common mental health challenges you're seeing them work through these
Yeah,
days?
that's a great question. A lot of it is kind of boring answers. A lot of people are overwhelmed by stress, anxiety, life transition stuff, addictions, relationships. It's kind of the answers that you would assume are kind of the easy hanging fruit. That does feel like it's the majority of what people are facing. And so I think what's kind of helpful there is going, when I'm facing anxiety or if I'm feeling overwhelmed or I'm not sure how to cope with X, Y, and Z or get unstuck from this behavior or substance, the fact that my answer is quite boring probably normalizes the struggle that someone listening might experience, right? So it's not, I mean, some of them are kind of more unique than others, but most of it is kind of middle of the road stuff. And what's interesting is you see it a lot with people who they're really nervous about therapy and they're so afraid to kind of share what it is they're experiencing. And the irony being on my side of the call is going, I've heard 100 people say they're struggling with pornography. And so they're terrified to kind of say it. But here I am going, I hear this weekly all the time. It's so normal for us to be working with it. And it's so normal for many people to be struggling with it. And, yeah, it speaks to the shame, but also the commonality that we're experiencing and the kind of uniqueness that traps us from being able to kind of share it and get the help we need.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How, like, I'm sure you see it when people say things for the first time. It's like, in my experience, though I'm not a therapist, when guys kind of open up for that first time, and maybe they're sharing something they've never shared with anyone, they physically look lighter. Like they just physically like unwind. It's like just letting the pressure valve off a little bit. Is that your experience when people kind of just are honest?
That's it. And the example that comes to mind that almost most demonstrates it. Like I've been in sessions where one partner has disclosed to the other one that there's been infidelity, and you're watching the other partner soak this in for the very first time, and you're kind of watching them kind of get traumatized by the reality of their relationship in real time. And then when I talk to that partner, maybe in an individual session after, they often feel relieved. And that's, they feel many things, right? But relief is one of them.
Yeah.
And so, that's probably one of the more intense examples, but anytime we're feeling that shame, it's heavy. It's heavy to hold on to. It's very difficult to share, but it's also really difficult to hold in and carry. And so that relief of being able to go, this is the worst part of me, I think. And then for it to be accepted and to be heard and held, it's like, lighter is the perfect word. That's exactly what we experience. And I think that's why when I think of scripture going, confess, and you'll experience healing on that. And that's the lighter thing, I think, like we're holding on to the shame, the sin, this whatever. We confess it. It's met by acceptance and love by God, by the people around us. And we go, I think that's pretty powerful.
It's so powerful, man. And a little bit of reading that I've been doing lately, and you can correct my thinking here if you're like, Jordan, yeah, don't read that stuff. It's just around how trauma and shame is actually stored in the body. And it's just amazing. Just a little bit, like, for example, recently my wife and I have been going through a bit of I wouldn't say stressful. It's been stressful. Okay. Maybe we'll turn this to a counseling session, but we've been moving a house, and we were supposed to be at my in-laws for 4 days. We were there for 4 weeks because of delays and things like this. My daughter starting school, some other things that were kind of happening. And so I was waking up in the morning with like the worst headaches. I'm like, what is going on? And my jaw and everything was so tight. And I'm like, oh man, this is actually the stress of my experience actually manifesting itself in our bodies. And it's amazing that lighter feeling is a part of that, like that we see in scripture, confess to one another and you'll be healed. There's actually the physiological science of the body is actually that trauma, stress, and anxiety actually is in the body. And so by confessing these things, you do experience that lighter feeling. Am I summarizing some of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of okay?
And I think, from a faith perspective, we don't really do the best job of kind of recognizing our body as a part of who we are. And so we go, my spiritual life is the most important. And, I hope my thoughts line up with that. And that's about most of the thinking we do when we conceptualize a sense of who we are. And so the idea that our thoughts, anxiety, stress have anything to do with our body is missed by a lot of us. And I don't know who to blame. I don't know if that's because of our Christianity or our rational lens in the West. Like, I don't know how much to blame on who. But I do know that we kind of sit with it. We don't really do a great job of that. And there's the word in our world is kind of somatic. Like that's kind of the body, where you start with the body instead of going, okay, what am I thinking, and kind of trying to figure things down, going, hey, what do I notice in my body, and kind of going from the bottom up. And it's a really powerful way to kind of get insight about yourself, about what you're experiencing, what you think, what you believe. Can be pretty powerful stuff. So even that's so wise on you. Sorry to keep going here, but like where you kind of noticed it was showing up in your body, and you were kind of tracing it back and going, that my bodily sensation is telling me something about my world. And it's powerful stuff.
Yeah, man. I think, like anything, there's extremes, right? And we always have to try and avoid the extremes on either side, like ignoring our body completely. Or, you might see in some of these studies around somatics kind of getting super awkward and cringy and yelling in the forest and these types of things, right? And so there is a balance in the sense. But one thing that I would invite men listening to is to not ignore the warning signs your body's giving you. Mm-hmm. Right? Like maybe some of the stress in your neck and shoulders is not necessarily because you're just working hard. And that could be it. But maybe you're also just stressed. And I think that's just, as our men are listening, have you even considered that maybe some of the things that you're experiencing in your body is because you've got something going on and you haven't taken time to reflect on that? And so I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's big. One of the things, and I see it in men because I work with men, so I don't know that this is exclusive to men. But what I do witness a lot in the people that I serve is a willingness to kind of serve the family, serve the kids, serve the household, do all of those things. And the thing that often gets missed is that they don't take care of themselves. And part of what I hope to kind of illuminate in those situations is to go, hey, you care about your family, you care about your wife, you care about all of these things. You are your best resource to administer that care. So if you're not going to the doctor, if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not actually in the best position to do the thing you want to do, which is care for your family and those sort of things. So, I think a lot of men, maybe some sense of guilt, or they don't know how to prioritize themselves because and it's coming from a good place. That's often a helpful reframe of going, oh, wait, okay. I want to be around. I want to be able to move. I need to actually carve out what I need to take care of this thing, the body that I have, in order to do the thing that I want. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think men they hear mixed voices, right? Like they hear mixed messaging in media and stuff. And so, there's never probably been more talk about men's mental health than, the day and age we live in. You think about Bell Let's Talk, and I think the whole month of June or maybe another month is dedicated to men's mental health, and which is great. We need that. But at the same time, you've got characters and social media voices that are saying like, actually, yeah, the answer isn't focusing on ourselves. It's to kind of, be to be stoic, and which is not necessarily a bad thing. And I'm not criticizing that. I think in some ways that's good for men. But you do hear people kind of saying like, we need to kind of reject this kind of cultural moment we are in about men being soft or weak or vulnerable. I think about Dana White. He was on a podcast recently, and I've got the quote here because I just thought it was kind of a good small picture of what is the greater narrative out there. And I'm going to have to beep out some of his language here because he has quite the filthy language. But he says this, he said, there's all this talk about men's mental health. I can't stand that blank. Yeah, guess what? Life is hard. It's nasty. It's ugly. It's an ugly world out there. It's not perfect. And you can't afford to be a man and talk publicly about, your mental health. We all have bad days and good days. And I believe as a man, you suck that blank up. Usually if you're a man, you've got a lot of people relying on you, your wife, your kids, possibly other family members. And if you run a business, every one of your employees. Yeah, there's no time for men's mental health. You're a blanking man. Get up, put your shoes on, get out there and be a man. Like that's the dichotomy we live in. We tune into some social media that says like, you know what, take time for yourself and consider what your body's telling you. And then we hear messaging like this, and men are saying like, man, how do I make sense of this moment? I don't want to feel emasculated and vulnerable and weak as this guy's describing, but I also know I've got to deal with my stuff. What's your internal reaction as you hear something like that, Ned?
I get it, honestly. Because a lot of the men that I see feel that way. It kind of goes back to what we kind of just talked about, where it's like, I don't have time to prioritize my mental health. Like, what do you want me to do? Cry to some other therapist? Like, what is that? I have all of these pressures all of these responsibilities, all of these things. I don't have time for that. I don't know if you up on your feed, there's this guy who comes up and he always like, there's some sort of scenario. It ends it with be a man. And it's sort of like, go to the doctor or like, cry to your wife about that. Like, no, like suck it up. Don't tell anybody and die of a heart attack. Be a man. Like, and that's like, I think it's hilarious because that is sort of the domino effect of that attitude when it's unchecked, right? So I empathize with the feeling of the responsibility. Other people are depending on me, and men like Dana White, who there's a lot of people employed by him, and probably rightfully feels that responsibility to the people who rely on him and the business, right? Coming from a good place, the missing part is if he does have a heart attack in a month, well, that's going to suck for everyone involved. So maybe it's worth getting the help, right? So it's coming from a good place. I empathize with it. It's just it's not as holistic as it needs to be, and it's a little bit short-sighted, potentially.
Yeah. And there's been a number of things that have shown up in his life where it's clearly like maybe he would have had done okay if he had some health support, right? And maybe someone coaching him along. And so, but it's interesting because I hear those things, and what worries me is that from my work with men in the ministry here, I know that young men love that message. They internally, they love the idea of putting on their shoes and going out there and climbing, voices like Jordan Peterson that are so popular right now, right? And he talks about like slaying the dragon. And there's a reason that there's something in young men. I don't know what this is, this like primal instinct to want to kind of be that dragon slayer type thing. And so when they hear a guy like Dana White say this, they think, yeah, you know what? There is no time for me to talk about. And I'm going, no, there is. Like you can be a man with ambition, and you can still be a man that's okay to be vulnerable. And recently in this time that I've talked to you about, my wife and I have been, I was just stressed, to be honest, with the move and kids, and I wasn't at my best. And I was talking to my cousin who he's kind of he's an executive at a company in Toronto, and he's pretty, he's in tune with his mental health. He gets it. He's very vulnerable and a great leader. And I said, man, I'm just really struggling right now. And he said, Jordan, listen, man. And in a much more sensitive way than what Dana said, he said, hey, man, all that sounds really hard, but you still have to show up well. And I thought that actually was a gentle prod to me to say, because I'm kind of the opposite. I'm, if you know me, I'm super vulnerable, and I share, probably overshare and things like that. And so his challenge to me kind of was a little bit much easier to swallow than Dana White. But he just said, Jordan, all this sounds really hard, but you still got to show up well for Rachel and the kids and your job and your church. Like, there is a sense where you do have to have the people to talk to, but don't bleed over everyone else. Like, have those spaces. And any thoughts on that? Like, is that kind of something you would say is like, hey, you know what? Yeah, it's difficult, but as a man, like, you do have responsibilities that you have to consider.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
It wouldn't be something I would say. However, it is something that's living inside of us, right? We want to feel strong. We want to feel competent. We want to feel like we're enough. And that we get in touch with that when we see ourselves accomplish things. And so I wouldn't say to someone who is vulnerable, hey, you need to kind of toughen up and rise up to the occasion. But oftentimes I'll just ask them, this is really tough. When you envision the best version of yourself that you want to be, how does he react? How does he want to show up for the situation? And right then and there, they get in touch with it really quickly. And then it's not me trying to like spark a fire. It's them going, yeah, no, this is really tough, but I do want to be this kind of husband. This is really tough, but I do want to be this kind of father. And it falls into place really quickly when you just ask them, hey, when you envision the best version of yourself, what does he do? It falls into place pretty quickly. So I'll ask that question pretty often. And that's, I think, helping clients get in touch with their own values.
Nick, that is actually, that was a masterclass, man, in helping someone come to kind of the conclusion that is helpful. I'm thinking, man, of the many times I'm tempted to be like, hey, dude, come on, you got to show up. But just to even ask them that question is super powerful, because ultimately they end up doing the same thing. They want to be a man who wins. They want to be a man who shows up. They want to be a man who does well. And so, yeah, I would just like to say to anyone that's listening, don't waste this opportunity, even now in the situation you find yourself, to just be curious about that too. What does the ideal version of yourself, what does he do in the middle of the situation? Yeah, I'm thinking about even just, thankfully we're through this move, but I'm thinking about, just like, who do I want to be in the midst of this chaos? Who do I want? Yeah, no, that's really, really good, man. Thank you. That was a gift.
But like sometimes it's really tough to know in the moment, right? To get in touch with that. And when people struggle to go, yeah, but in the moment I can't figure that out, the advice I give in that moment is to practice with the past, right? So even when you were kind of talking about, okay, I might have flubbed it on the move, you can still go back and go, okay, in the morning when I messed up, what does the best version of me do? Okay, let's say I messed that up, but then at 9 o'clock at night, at that juncture, what would I have done at that point if I could kind of intervene? And those imaginative repetitions, they count because they just connected to your values. Now you're more connected to your values. And now in the present, they're more accessible. So imagining about the past, it's kind of a rep. It does give you practice in a helpful way.
Yeah. And then you're living with intention, right? You're not just reacting. You're not just like kind of like a, sleepwalking through life. You're actually being intentional about, okay, tomorrow I can try and get it right this time. Wow. Oh, that's helpful, man. I'm curious, Nick, when you're working with young men, and how do you reframe the idea around vulnerability actually being a sign of strength? Because it's hard to get guys to that point of being vulnerable. And my experience is oftentimes in my experiences, the pain of their situation gets too great. It gets greater than the pain of actually having to confess or to get help. And so they're kind of forced out there because, like, okay, my addiction was exposed, or I've spent all my money on, this behavior, or I'm on academic probation, or whatever the case may be. They're kind of forced out there. And so how do you do that? How do you kind of get them to, before it gets too painful, kind of?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of the times we aren't in touch with the emotions. Like when we think about vulnerability, as a society, we talk about being objective and unbiased and all of those sort of things. The human connective part of us doesn't really care about objective reality. It's actually all about the subjective reality. If I told you, hey, I wore gray socks yesterday, 2 days ago I had tuna for lunch, at 9 p.m. I walked 3 steps to the kitchen. Like, you don't get to know me at all. So the objective reality of my life really doesn't matter. If I tell you, like, I was at this scenario and this person was rude to me and I got really upset, that's all subjective, but now you feel connected to me, right? So trying to illuminate the fact that our subjective reality is actually the thing that makes us feel in touch with ourselves and connects us with each other. Objective reality doesn't matter for that purpose. And the other part of it is when we struggle with being vulnerable, it's often not that we don't want to, it's that we don't even know how. And so oftentimes there's this thing called a feelings wheel. It's like a big wheel and it's got all these labels, and I'll help people walk through the entire wheel and identify everything that they're feeling just in that moment. And I'll usually ask them before, like, hey, if I ask you right now, how you feeling? How do you feel? They'll be like, good. And then we'll go through the wheel and they'll have like 50 different labels. I'll kind of go back and, okay, so I asked you and you said good, but if we were to kind of run it back, you got 50 different options that you could have said right now. And oftentimes that's kind of a light bulb moment of like, I got feelings. I didn't think I did, but I think I do. I got 51 of them at least, right? And so just kind of building some acceptance about their humanity, really, right? And I think when we want to be strong, if our image is strength means not in touch with our emotions, you kind of don't want to take away the desire to be strong. But you do want to go, yeah, I see the strength, but I also kind of see a human. Like, you're just a human, just like all of us too. And so is it possible that you just don't have these feelings? I mean, not likely, right? And it's kind of slow and people kind of become aware of that at different paces and such, but it's kind of reckoning with ourselves. It's going, I'm not the stoic rock that is devoid of emotions that I want to be or thought I was. Actually, I'm more human and creature-like than I thought. And that might be upsetting, but doesn't take the reality away.
Right. And yeah, and oftentimes it's like our desire to be like that stoic, you live in like a bit of a self-denial, right? And so you live kind of thinking like, I'm not upset. I'm good. I got this. And it's actually, if you look a little bit below the surface and you take time with someone like you, Nick, it's like, oh man, I haven't really been in touch with this. And partly because men aren't supposed to do this, according to people like Dana White. And so, I'm interested, just just around the ideas of vulnerability. You see in the scriptures even, where it says like the whole idea of like, I boast in my weakness, right? Why is that not the theme verse of a men's conference, right? I boast in my weakness because it's in my weakness that actually, God's strength is made perfect. His power is made perfect. And, we like the verses that say, act like men. But if you look at the men in scripture and you look at kind of them and their vulnerability, Jesus is a great example of a man who actually lived with a sense of purpose, ambition. I think there's some scriptures where it's like he set his face like flint to go towards the cross. Like he was so focused on his mandate from his father. But at the same time, the dude was completely in touch with his emotions from what I can see in the scriptures.
No,
I don't know what you think about that.
My own therapist, because I was working out some of this stuff with him, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm kind of flirting with the stoic stuff. It seems like really good. And he, a good therapist is going to ask you questions more than just kind of say it to your face. But this is one of those moments he's like, no, don't do that. That's bad. You're just going to repress yourself and that's not going to be helpful. And he was very direct. And I thank him for that moment. And what he helped me, realize is in Jesus, like we don't often think about it, but he was a very emotional man. And if hearing that makes you go, well, no. It's like, I think you're confusing emotional with lacking self-control. That's not the same, right?
That's good.
Jesus was angry enough, sustained anger to braid a whip and toss tables, right? That wasn't a flash in the pan. Yeah. That was a sustained emotional anger. Doesn't mean he lost control, right? Now, I don't know how to interpret that. So if theological questions come in, Jordan, that's probably going to be your corner, not mine, but
I'll send them back to you. Don't worry.
He weeps over Israel, right? He weeps over Lazarus, even though he knew he was going to heal him. So I don't know that I have the capacity or know anyone who has the capacity to be like, this situation's hard. I'm going to solve it. And yet I have the emotional accessibility to weep in the present over a situation I know is going to be resolved in 24 hours. And yet very emotional Jesus. And this one is a little bit more gray, but he sweats blood in the garden, which is a stress response. So I don't know if it's okay to call, at least it's okay, I think, to call it stress. I think it'd get a little bit dicey if I called it anxiety, like worry, but it's not too far of a leaf. It's a bit of a gray. So you don't have to take that one with the first two examples. I feel more confident in the first two, but you look at his life and he's moved by compassion. He's moved by anger. He's moved by sadness. He's a very, very emotional man. And when I say that, don't confuse that to say a man who lacks self-control, but he definitely wasn't this stoic stone of a man, not in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. And I love that because I think some men need to get in touch with that side of Jesus, right? Like I do think there are men that are, that could resonate with that. The other side of it is some men don't want that part of Jesus. Right. Like the other side of it is like, I want the strong, throwing tables over type thing, Jesus. And my encouragement to people is like, don't just view Jesus how you want him to be viewed. Like take a moment, reflect through the scriptures and allow Jesus to be Jesus. Right. Because I think oftentimes people want him to be a certain way. And so it's like, listen, if Jesus was man enough to cry, if he was man enough to show sustained anger at injustice or at what really upset him, I want to be willing to do that as well. Again, what's interesting is you mentioned that differentiation between self-control and emotionalism, because self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. And so there's men out there that might be very emotional, right? But using their anger and they're not self-controlled. And so that's also not a sign of godly masculinity. I'm emotional. I get upset at things. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? Right? Because that's not the vision God has for your mental health either, to be an angry man that people tiptoe around all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Hey, listen, man, I'm curious, as kind of getting towards the end here, the second half, let's talk about the men that might be listening and they're struggling right now. And, maybe they can't put a label to it, or maybe they're anxious or worried, or they just have a sense of panic, or maybe they're depressed or whatever. What would you say is some of the signs that men can kind of look to and say, I'm not sure I'm doing well. Maybe I should reach out to someone.
Yeah. A friend of mine asked me this question: can you live like this for the next 5 years? And that was a really powerful question that he just asked me in life. And if the answer is yes, then maybe this isn't a big deal, right? But if the answer is no, if you're like, man, could I survive another 5 years of this? I think that's a sign to go, okay, something's got to change. Hey, and you don't have to know what the answer is in order to start the process. Some movement is just going to be better than trying to figure it out by yourself, right? And sometimes it can be really difficult to ask for help. And in those moments, I try to just make an appeal from the rest of their life. So in this area, there's maybe shame or a desire to be able to figure it out by yourself. And what I would just I'd try to be a little bit persuasive here and go, well, hang on now. You already accept help from hundreds of people.
Yeah.
You didn't stitch your own clothes. You didn't build a power plant that turns your lights on. You didn't plumb the house. You didn't mark the roads. You didn't build a car. You didn't farm the food. Like, you are already accepting help from hundreds and thousands of people at every point in your life. Why is this one the weird one where you want to just do this on your own? And I kind of try to invert it a little bit and not make this one special, but to go, for whatever reason, you're treating this problem like the weird one when you already accept help everywhere else. So hopefully we can kind of destigmatize whatever this thing is. And I'm one of thousands of therapists, meaning whatever you're facing, thousands of people before you and after you are going to face the very thing that you're facing. And so sometimes that shame or that feeling of uniqueness actually works against us in just getting the help we need. And it can be kind of scary. And I'm not quite sure what the mental block is, but we just think that our problems are more unique than they are. To put it plainly, it's just not the case. And so you don't have to figure out how to become a triathlon to start going to a gym. You just kind of go to the gym and you figure it out as you go, right? And so let's say therapy might be part of your solution. Just try it out, book a bunch of consults, see who you feel connected to.
Yeah.
And if you try it out for a couple of sessions and it doesn't work, then maybe you learn that therapy wasn't the answer, or maybe you realize that a part of that therapist didn't connect, but therapy might hold something for you. Maybe a different fit is better. And so just kind of get the ball rolling wherever you can, therapy or whatever the solution is for whatever problem you're facing. And you'll just get more movement if you move somewhere rather than just try to figure out the whole game plan up front.
Yeah, it's interesting. That whole idea of like, my issue is too unique. What I've also heard from guys is my issue is not unique enough. Right? Like, everybody has a struggle.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Or like, it's not as bad. Like, it's not
Right.
that bad. Right? It's not that intense. And so I don't need to get help because, well, I'm not suicidal. Right? Or
Yeah.
I'm not, I'm not hiring
Sure.
prostitutes. Like, I'm not, it's like, well, you don't need to be super unique. And you also don't need to be just, if you're even curious about this, man, in my own therapy journey, going to that first thing was like, I thought I was kind of the guy that thought I was really unique and really, they're going to think I'm super weird. And it's like, oh man, this is so accessible, so easy. So like these guys do this all the time. And so if you're a guy and you're curious about that, I would say, man, like, listen to Nick, like, do the consults, find the right person, and having a therapist in your kind of holistic health journey is like, man, so beneficial. Nick, at the same time, counseling or therapy in particular is not always super accessible for some guys in some contexts, right? And, there's tons of great counselors out there that offer, subsidies and discounts for people that maybe financially can't make it. I'm thinking, and, I grew up in a really small town where there wasn't a lot of resources. Like my high school had my K to 6 school had like 40 students, right? So it was a small town. So there wasn't like a counselor on the corner type thing. Thankfully, with, I guess, technology and stuff now, it's much easier. But what's some things people can do if they're like, okay, I don't got coverage, seeing a counselor is not in the budget. How can I just kind of begin to find help, whether through therapy, through some creative means, or just finding some kind of mental wellness?
Yeah. I'll speak to the wellness piece. The best things I think you can do for your mental health are the boring answers, like sleep, diet and exercise, and social connection. And those are really big protective factors. So if you think about where you're at and the impending stress that is encroaching on you, the protective factors that keep you from that, I would say the big three are kind of sleep, diet, and exercise, and social connection. And so if you're doing those things, you're doing most of the work, or most of, right? Taking care, and your body's probably, well, that's diet and exercise. And, when it comes to finding maybe psychological help, here's what I would say is that, there are affordable options. So when people are finishing up school, they're interning in a number of places. So there is more affordable options via students, and they don't have the same level of experience because they're just starting out. And so you just have to make your peace with that. So they're not completely unqualified. They may not have the same seasonedness. I mean, I'm fairly new to the journey, so I don't want to present myself like I've been in the game forever, right? But so they are going to be figuring out some of their own therapeutic muscles as well, but they're there to listen. They're there to be present, and they are being trained, and they are learning things that can be helpful for you. So if the therapy that you envision is very out of reach financially, you consider, okay, yeah, I might not have the LeBron James of therapists, whoever he or she is, but I can still get some help with someone who is within reach. And especially with online too, there's a lot of people who can be accessible at a number of different price points. And so take a second lap, and you kind of do maybe have to just weigh it out and go, yeah, I might not get someone with 10 years of experience, but I can still get some help. And I need some help more than I need the perfect help or no help at all. So I wouldn't let that kind of perfectionistic envisionment of what help is going to look like detract from getting any help at all.
Yeah. I would echo that. My experiences too is like, if you get creative and you look around, it's amazing what is out there, right? Like sometimes we make conclusions like, oh, I can't afford it. It's like, well, and that may be the case for some. I'm not downplaying that, but I think about like, I was in pastoral ministry for many years, and there was times where people would approach the church and we would say, yeah, we've got a budget line in our budget to help people that, benevolently for things like this. And so, if you're part of a local church, like, don't hesitate to ask, like, hey, if your son or daughter is struggling with this, or if you're struggling with this, they might have some resources that you might not be thinking of, that they would be happy to help you with that as well. And so, but yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that those three simple things. I forget who it was. It actually might have been Peterson, who at one time said like the change he sees in some of his clients that have like crippling anxiety by just sleeping, eating, and exercising was like astronomical. Like obviously it's not a fix all. It's not going to be like, the silver bullet, but it does have incredible effects on people's mental health. And unfortunately the boring stuff's hard to do, right? We want the silver bullet when it comes to mental health.
We do. I've being on the client side, I've been like, all right, can we pull a trick out? Like from like therapists that I've hired, like, what's the next magic trick? Like, what's the next magic wand? What's the thing that's going to make it all go away? And there just isn't. But it doesn't mean that the help isn't there. It's just it's different than you would hope it would be. It'd be easy. It'd be amazing if I had the magic wand. I'd probably charge a lot more. But yeah, I know that. Actually, let me speak to it in this way. Sometimes we think that the problems need to be solved, and there are solutions there, and there is growth there. But many of our problems in the present, it's not necessary that we need it solved per se, but they need to be held with someone. And so even if you think about the last time you were really overwhelmed, a solution would have been good, but sometimes you kind of look to your partner or your friend and you go, hey, can I just share this with you? I just need to be heard right now. And that's enough, right? Like if you think about, I love this, we have an emotional need to be soothed. And the illustration that I like to share with this is like getting a back rub. So if you think about getting a back rub, a back rub objectively does nothing for you. Doesn't solve the problem, doesn't make it go away. It doesn't prevent it from happening in the future. So on paper, a back rub is completely useless. But if you have ever had 1,000 things going on and you've got a back rub, it's magic. It makes everything better, right? Why? Because we're subjective and we're emotional creatures, and that part needs to be attended to us as well. Therapy could be a little bit complicated. It's not always about finding the magic bullet as it is sometimes having someone to walk with as you sort yourself out towards that goal.
Wow. I think that's an incredible way to end the podcast, man. The idea of a problem not to be solved, but something to be held with someone else. And I just think if you are listening today, gentlemen, and you're walking through something, do you have someone? Do you have someone that can hold this, and someone that's not going to, maybe try and give you the silver bullet that probably won't work, or to tell you what to be doing, someone to listen and someone to offer good advice. Therapists like Nick are a great example. Nick, man, I want to thank you for being here today. And you're going to actually be with us at an upcoming conference doing a session on men's mental health on November 2nd. We're really stoked to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to come. Some of the illustrations that I shared, you'll hear again in the session. But yeah, we'll kind of unpack it on a more detailed level and continue the work. Glad to be a part.
Continue the work, man. Well, thank you, Nick. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon.
Looking forward to it.